I think possibly because it reminds me more of the old country than Sydney. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Anna for organising this meeting. There's a lot of work gone into it, and I know that she's done an excellent job, and I personally would like to thank her for that. Before she came up here that she was a little bit nervous. That reminds me of a time when I was in Chicago giving a talk. I was in the hotel pacing up and down, and a lady walked in. She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm here to give a speech." She said, "What, are you nervous?" I said, "No, I'm not nervous." She said, "Then what are you doing in the ladies' room?" Well, I'm going to talk to you this evening about a variety of subjects. I see on the programme there's a whole range of things that I'm to cover. And the first one deals with the subject of diet. Now, of course, everybody's interested in diet, aren't they? Things to eat. Is your diet killing you? Well, to some extent the answer is yes. And that is even if it's a relatively good diet. Because when you eat food, some things are generated in the body, which you've probably heard about, I'm sure you've all read about them. They're called free radicals. Now these are electrically charged particles in the blood, which circulate around the body, looking for somewhere to latch onto, as it were. And one of their favourite sites, of course, is the blood itself, red blood cells, for instance. When you look at red blood cells under the microscope, you can often see changes that occur as a result of free radical action. They're misshapen, they're damaged, they're what we call crenated. And these free radicals are produced every time you eat something. But of course, certain foods and certain types of diets will produce many more free radicals than others. The spread that you have today, for instance, fresh fruit, salad, vegetables and so on, is minimal. But even from those foods, free radicals are dispersed in the body. And one thing I would emphasize here, there's always a good reason not to eat too much. One of the evils today is that people eat far too much. And I think it was Dr. John Tilden who used to say, a third of what we eat enables us to live. 2/3 of what we eat enables the doctors to live. And that's about right, because if you look at typical nutritional programs, you look at the typical conventional books on nutrition, and you look at the diets, and they're worked on the basis of calories. And often the RDAs, the recommended daily allowance, is far in excess of what the body needs. So consequently, the majority of people do, in actual fact, grossly overeat. Now, some people, not all people, as a result of this gross overeating, some people gain quite a lot of weight. Others, of course, are able to metabolize the excess. But nevertheless, they suffer the consequences. So one of my first cautions to people is try to avoid overeating. In fact, there's a colleague of mine in the United States, Dr. Ralph Cinque, and for a number of years now, he's been working on the theory of trying to eat as little as he can get by on. So every so often he goes through his diet and cuts it back, and he cuts it back. Until finally, of course, he's losing quite a considerable amount of weight, and he realizes that he's probably gone over the top. But nevertheless, for the majority of people, they eat far too much. And of course, this is excellent if you're in the food business or you're in the restaurant business. That's what you want people to do. But it's not good for one's health. Now, when we start any discussion of diet, we have to consider we have two vital ingredients: the food and the feeder, that is the person eating the food. Now when you read books on nutrition or books on diet, and they recommend a certain diet, one has to appreciate that this is just a general book. A typical one, for instance, that's been very popular in recent years is the book Fit for Life. And some people get along very well with the recommended dietary program. Others, of course, don't get on so well. Because when we look at the food or the diet, we've overlooked the importance of the feeder, the person who eats the food. And to the hygienist, the person who eats the food is more important than the food he eats. Because obviously, when we come to look at health, health as related to functional efficiency is a very personal thing. And it depends on so much more than food. I mean, there are people who, of course, are extremely neurotic about their food. They worry about every little morsel that goes in their mouth. They worry every day whether they're getting enough of this particular nutrient or the other particular nutrient. Am I getting enough magnesium? Am I getting enough zinc? Am I getting enough vitamin C? Of course, it's only in this last century that we've ever heard of these substances in food. And yet the human race has evolved to its present state without this knowledge. So generally speaking, if we're eating generally a good basic diet, we're going to get all of these nutrient essentials. So it's very important to consider nutrition as being a process which involves the utilization of food by an individual. And as we know, the very word individual means something specific, something peculiar or particular. Individual doesn't mean a general blueprint program. So there can be no blueprint program of diet that you can offer to the general public and say, this is a diet that will suit everybody. No such thing. There may be 100 different diets that are quite suitable nutritionally. So it's important that the individual learn about themselves. And as Anna pointed out at the beginning, one of the most basic things in hygiene is that people accept responsibility for their health. People don't like to do this, you know. They like to hand this responsibility over to somebody else, usually the doctor, some professional. But in actual fact, if you really look at it seriously, ladies and gentlemen, you cannot get rid of this particular responsibility. Because if you appreciate it, people say to me, look, if I get sick, I want to go to the doctor. I want him to take the responsibility. I don't want the responsibility of looking after my health. I want the doctor to take the responsibility. Well, I have news for you. This is not really possible because, believe me, if anything goes wrong, it happens to you, not the doctor. So you have to appreciate that the responsibility is yours whether you like it or not. Only this morning I read a report of a study conducted at Harvard University, Public Health School. This university found in the United States that around about 180,000 people die every year as a result of medical mistakes or errors, or in hospitals given them the wrong blood or the wrong drug or whatever. 180,000 people are killed as a result of errors of treatment. That report was released only recently. In Australia, of course, we don't have the same population. The number is somewhat less. There's somewhere around 30,000 people in Australia that either die or are extremely badly affected by errors of treatment, errors of drugs, or what is called iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis merely means caused by the treatment or caused by the physician. So we must first of all understand and recognize the need for us to take responsibility. The great need of our age is valid information about health. I mean, you pick up any newspaper today or any publication, any magazine, and there's some article dealing with diet or some aspect of health. And the important thing to look at there is, do they have a product to sell? Are they marketing any apparatus or any particular products? Because if they are, you can be sure that the article or the presentation will be in some way biased. Now, the hygienist has no apparatus to sell, no potions to sell, no drugs to sell, no nutrients to sell. The only thing that we have available are ideas from up here. Education is the important thing. Education is the need of our age. So we need to become educated, because as health is the great need of our age, we need knowledge to care for ourselves. There are so many affronts to our health in modern society that we need to know what to do in order to avoid many of the pitfalls. We have to know what to do in order to care for ourselves, both in health and if we should get sick. Occasionally, of course, we may need hospital care. Heaven hopes that we don't, but it may be necessary at certain times. Crisis care is occasionally necessary, and hospitals are extremely good at crisis care. But nevertheless, there are these dangers that I've highlighted. Somewhere around 20% of the people in hospitals today, especially the major hospitals, are there because of treatment they've received. And if you go into a major hospital these days, you have about a 1 in 6 chance of developing a disease in the hospital that you didn't have when you were admitted. And you have about a 1 in 30 chance of dying from it. So these are, in actual fact, dangerous places. So it does behoove us to care for our health intelligently, and in order to do that, we need knowledge. Now, when we're talking about diet, what do we mean by a diet, being on a diet? A person says to me, I'm on a diet. I said, that's interesting, so am I. I don't know of anybody who isn't on a diet. We're all on a diet. It's just that there are good diets, bad diets, and moderate, mediocre diets. But everybody's on a diet, because food is a basic precondition of life. We can't live without food, not indefinitely. We'll talk a little bit about fasting a little later. We can live for a temporary period without food, but the human body is not capable of surviving for an extended period of time without eating. We need food. Food is necessary to carry on the necessary machinery of life. So everybody is on a diet. Let's understand that from the beginning. Now, diets can be made up of a wide variety of foods, as we know. They can be vegetarian diets, such as the one we've had this evening, which is, in actual fact, a vegan diet. I don't think there are any animal foods there. Well, a vegan diet means that it's absolutely devoid of all animal foods. Then you have vegetarian diets. Sometimes vegetarian diets may be devoid of all animal foods. And then people say, well, I'm on a lacto-vegetarian diet. That means that they include dairy products. Or they may say that on a pisco-lacto-vegetarian diet. That means that they're including some fish. Or they may be on what we call a carno-vegetarian diet, where they include some meat as well. So the whole thing becomes quite ridiculous. But diet merely means that we have to use food to supply materials with which the body needs with which to work. And these materials, of course, are not terribly extensive. We don't need hundreds of thousands of different nutrients. There's only 2 or 3 dozen of them. And they are provided to us in abundance by nature in natural foods. It was only a couple of weeks ago that a man rang me and said that he'd eaten some mushrooms and he was feeling very sick. They were obviously poisonous mushrooms. He said, what do you recommend? I said, a change of diet. And that's not unreasonable, is it? If you're going to eat food, so-called food. But we do get mixed up with this idea of food. For instance, you often hear the term bandied around about food poisoning. Now, doesn't that seem a bit of a contradiction to you? There's no such thing as food poisoning. Food poisoning is poison poisoning. Food doesn't poison you. It's either the food was originally food and it's now gone rotten, it's bad, or it contains some toxin which is so malevolent that it's made you sick. But certainly the food, if it's genuine food, it did not make you sick. So this idea of food poisoning is a little bit like that concept of natural health. They use this term natural health as though there's some other sort. You know, there's only one sort of health. There is no such thing as natural health. That's what health actually is. So we should try and get our terms right. So in relation to diet, we're all on a diet. Diet provides us with the basic materials the body needs with which to work. That is, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, minerals, vitamins, and water. Those are the categories. There really aren't any others. Of course, in Western society, most people nowadays live like the kings and royalty used to live centuries ago. They have adopted a highly concentrated, high-fat, high-protein, high-carbohydrate diet. And of course, for the last 20 or 30 years, fat has got something of a bad reputation. And I think this has come about once again because of the gross overeating that people engage in. I mean, there are diets that one looks at occasionally where people are taking over 60% of their calories in fat. That just becomes ridiculous. And consequently, people do have problems with that. But then again, all fat is not the same. A lot of the books you read about fat, you would think that fat is fat is fat. All fat is the same. But it isn't. There's a great deal of difference between the fat that comes along in beef and the fat that comes in an avocado. There's a great deal of difference in the fat that you would get from a sausage and the fat that you would get from a Brazil nut. They're both fatty foods, but the fat is quite different. And the way the body responds to these fats is quite different. Also, there's a difference with the cooking of fat. When we cook fat, it becomes partially decomposed. I mean, you look at fast food places around the place. I know in Victoria you do have fast food places because I've seen a few on the way from the airport here. Well, you imagine they're frying foods. Most of them fry food. How often, for instance, with, say, chipped potatoes, how often do they change the fat? They fry the chips, they put more potatoes in, but I don't see them change the fat. Now, fat is seriously impaired and is actually slowly converted into a poison by constantly heating and boiling. Various free radicals develop. Acrolein is produced, which is quite toxic. And I don't know how often these various places do change the fat, but I can assure you if it's every time they fry chips, the chips would be very expensive. So, when we eat fat, if you're eating raw fat, say contained in a Brazil nut or an almond or a macadamia or a walnut or cashew or whatever, it's a lot different from eating the fat that has been fried and subjected to many heatings over a long period of time. These are the types of fat that are going to cause problems for you. But I don't think we need to become totally neurotic about fat when it relates to simple things like nuts and avocado. Furthermore, we look at proteins. Now, in our Western society, again, we have an extremely high protein diet. It's not unusual for people to be taking somewhere in the region of 100 to 150 grams of protein a day, when it's quite easily, by simple experimentation, to show that a person can't use any more than about 17 to 20 grams a day. What happens to the rest? Well, of course, the body has to metabolize it. This provides a lot of work for the liver. The body has no ability to store protein. It can store carbohydrate to a limited extent as an animal form of starch called glycogen, and it can certainly store fat, we know that. But it has no ability to store protein. So protein has to be either converted into fat and a highly acid waste produced. And this highly acid waste, of course, has to be eliminated through the liver. It's a process called oxidative deamination, where the amino acids are broken down in the protein and the protein is converted to fat. That's a very expensive way of producing fat when you can get fat abundantly anyway. Protein is also an expensive type of food. So why take so much protein when the body can only use a little? And it's actually harmful to take an excess. People on a high protein diet usually will evolve cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, renal and gallbladder stones and things of this type. Not unusual for them to go along that route. High protein diets are also related to the evolution of cancer. Cancer is always at its highest incidence in those countries which consume the highest protein in their diets. So we should be careful about protein and restrict it. Vegetable foods, of course, are low-protein foods, generally. So we usually keep away from the animal foods in that respect. Carbohydrates, once again, are abundant. The problem with carbohydrates is the body uses carbohydrate as its main source of energy, and it's a great energy provider. But what we do again in our society is that we tend to use refined carbohydrates. Most of your breads, or your pastas, and your high carbohydrate foods are produced from refined, demineralized, devitamized carbohydrates, and even your bread. So what they do with your bread, of course, the flour is milled, you lose all the minerals and vitamins, and about half a dozen nutrients they put back in again, and they call it enriched. Now that's like a man going out for the evening and he gets round the corner and somebody hits him over the head and robs him. And he's standing there in his underpants with nothing but, and the man says to him, well, I've taken everything from you, here's 10 cents for you to get home on the bus. Would you feel enriched? But of course, the food processor, you always have to appreciate, ends up with a product inferior to the one he started with. And that's inevitable. So another thing that we're saying about diet, try to go for whole foods. The less manipulation, the less refining, the less adulteration that's taken place, the better. Not only do we have refining and processing, but we also have the use of a lot of food additives. Now, it might surprise you to know that there are over 6,000 chemicals used in the refining and processing of foods. And there's only about 50 of them that have ever been subjected to any experimental analysis to find out what the long-term effects are upon living organisms. So many of them have just been used in a traditional fashion. And of course, many people have discovered from bitter experience how these substances affect them. Quite recently at the clinic we had a lady who'd been living in Korea for the last 12 months or so and had suffered very, very badly as a result of a very high consumption of M.Sc, monosodium glutamate, which is used extensively in Southeast Asia. It is used very rarely in Australia, I think, nowadays, because it's being given a fairly bad press. But we have to concern ourselves with the complex effect of food additives, which do affect people very seriously, particularly in large doses over a long period of time. We also have to concern ourselves with agricultural exploitation, the use of sprays, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides and the like. And these, of course, find their way into the foods. The Environmental Protection Agency in the United States has found cases where fruits and vegetables have contained over 400 times the legal limit of pesticides. And not just twice as much or 3 times as much, but 400 times. Obviously, the person would suspect so-called food poisoning from such ingredients. So we have to look to these things as well, and at the present time there is a significant push to the use of organic foods, foods that are organically cultivated. And this, I think, is a step in the right direction and well worthwhile. In Sydney we have a number of places, and I do know that in Melbourne there are such places where you can acquire organically grown food, and you should do your best to try and get that if you possibly can. So what we see then with the what's called the SAD diet, the Standard Australian Diet, you have this high protein, high fat, refined and processed carbohydrates. I mean, one of the things we see with many of the Italian foods, the Italians eat a lot of pasta. That's fine if it's from whole grain products, but unfortunately the pasta is from refined and processed carbohydrates. That leads to deficiencies. What are the problems with eating refined and processed foods? Well, one of the problems is that as the body uses food nutritionally, it requires many different nutrients for the proper metabolism of the food. Now, if the food is deficient in the first place, the body will draw on its own reserves to try to utilize or metabolize that food, so that we can get, over a longer period of time, significant nutritional deficiencies on the Standard Australian diet. And unless one supplements the diet with lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, then the consequences can be quite serious. And this is especially so with growing and developing children. Now, I might just launch into an area of discussing children for a brief period. I mean, illnesses among children, generally speaking, are the results of parents' mistakes. And parents' mistakes are more commonly the result, as I've said earlier, of ignorance. Now, what we see these days is a newborn infant who might be breastfed or milk-fed for a very, very brief period of time. And I frequently encounter infants of only 3 months of age who are having the general foods that the parents are eating. Now, it's rather interesting that the young of all mammalian species survive initially on mother's milk, which is equally natural for the human being. And one major characteristic of milk is that it has no fibre in it. It's a completely fibre-free food. No fibre whatsoever, because fibre is extremely damaging to the gastrointestinal tract of the young infant. But mothers are persuaded and convinced that as soon as possible they should get this young infant onto solid food. And often they start off with starches and fruits and vegetables, which are high fibre foods. So consequently we have all sorts of problems, gastroenteritis and digestive problems, and all sorts of difficulties that arise from this very, very early major error in feeding. When we look at other species, we find that mammalian species generally, the young will stay on mother's milk until they are adequately developed to handle other foods, which means they have to have a mouthful of teeth. Not just 2 or 3 in the front, but a whole mouthful of teeth. And consequently, we find the human being is very, very rarely fed for more than a month or 2 on mother's milk. Very, very rarely. Occasionally, 6 months, and very, very rarely a year. But most times, the young infant is on solid food very, very quickly. And this sets the seeds for all sorts of problems. Usually mucus problems, catarrhal states, bronchial difficulties, upper respiratory tract infections, middle ear problems, and all of these things, usually as a result of the introduction of refined and processed carbohydrates and fiber foods much too early. Now it's interesting that when you examine the gastrointestinal tract of the young infant, you find that many of the enzymes which are necessary to the digestion of carbohydrates are lacking. They often don't appear until the infant has a mouthful of teeth. So consequently, although they may be fed these foods, they're not capable of utilizing them properly. So it's unwise to force a young child to eat a wide range of foods at a very, very young age. We should keep the diet simple. Now I realize, of course, that it's not altogether convenient for mothers to breastfeed babies for very long. They have various family commitments and business and so on, and it's more convenient if they can wean the child early. And of course the dairy industry has already persuaded us that when mother has finished, the cow or the goat or whatever should take over. And of course there is some sense to this, because the milk of all mammalian species does have certain properties in common. And once again, the use of other animal milks may be justified on the basis that once, as I've said, it is fibreless. There's no fibre in it, so it has that advantage. The only thing, of course, that it doesn't have all of the protective ingredients that mother's milk does. As the child goes along, usually in the first 2 or 3 years of life, they have frequent colds, they have upper respiratory tract infections, they have bronchitis, middle ear problems, and all sorts of things like that, which is almost invariably due to poor feeding and a poor state of nutrition, which has resulted from inadequate consideration of the diet and the feeding program. So, with children, we must realize that we have an enormous responsibility here. Not only to educate ourselves about our own health, but to educate ourselves on how to feed intelligently infants and young children. And I think it's always wise to realize that the growing child has a much more critical nutritional requirement than the adult. It's a very, very rapid period of growth, so those food factors that are important to growth, development, repair, are extremely important in the case of the young child. So greater attention to diet must be given. But of course this is pretty straightforward. It's interesting to note that the majority of children are totally addicted to sugar, because they're given soft drinks, they're given lots of sweet things, they're given things like ice creams, they're given various sweets, chocolates, cakes, biscuits, confectionery, which possesses or contains a great deal of sugar. And as many of us know, sugar tends to be habit-forming. We like sweet things. Almost everybody likes sweet things. It's the natural and it's the strongest sense of taste that we have. We have essentially 4 senses of taste: sweet, sour, and bitter. And what's the other one? Salt, exactly. So people will go for salt, they go for sour things, they go for bitter things, and they very, very much go for sweet things. So children get easily hooked on sweet things. And of course, when we talk about sugar, this is refined and processed sugar. I always remember the famous book written by Professor John Yudkin in the late 60s. It was called Pure, White and Deadly. And that was the result of his research into sugar. Sugar does not appear generally in nature as sugar. It appears as part of food. One of the few places where it might appear as mostly sugar is in honey. And we must remember, of course, that honey is an animal food, that it's 99% sugar. But apart from in honey, we don't find in fruits and vegetables or readily available in nature sugar as sugar. There's a lot of difference between eating sugar and chewing sugar cane. There's a lot of difference between eating sugar and eating dates or figs or grapes or some sweet fruit. When we have the sweet fruit, we have a lot of other nutrients with the sugar. Now, for many, many years it was shown that the high sugar diet causes many problems. Vascular disease. John Yudkin, in his book, as I say, published many years ago, the result of almost a lifetime of research, was able to itemize many conditions, all the way from rheumatism, arthritis, cardiovascular disease, hemorrhoids, gastrointestinal troubles, and of course the major one, and particularly when it pertains to young children, is dental caries. And of course, instead of trying to get the sugar out of the diet, they would prefer to put fluoride in the water, which once again is not only is it an exploitation of the remedy mentality, but the unfortunate thing about what I call the remedy mentality is that people would rather take a remedy than attempt to remove the cause. But unfortunately, this really cannot be achieved. I mean, you have to appreciate that the drunken man does not become sober because he drinks strong coffee. He doesn't become sober because he drinks water, or because he drinks tea, or because he takes some remedy. He becomes sober because he stops drinking alcohol. And that's the only way he will. And it's my business, really, to try to persuade people that the only way that they will get rid of their problems is by attacking the causes. Now, when it relates to health, health and disease are not matters of chance or accident. They are basically matters of law and order. They occur as a result of an orderly sequence of events, a causal chain, if you like. And health is not ruined by a single cause in most cases. It's usually we're dealing with multiple causes. And people have to learn about these causes. They must learn to see cause and effect. But because you might drink something and you don't, or eat something, and because you don't drop dead within 20 minutes, doesn't necessarily mean that that food, or whatever you call it, was good. It may take many years to have its effect, but it will have an effect. But what we have to understand is that we can only have health, and good health, on nature's terms. There is no magic potion. There are no magic remedies. There are no magic medicines. There are no magic drugs. All right, the advertising material might try and persuade us of such, but it doesn't happen that way. Health and disease are not matters of chance and accident, as I've pointed out. Health and disease represent a continuum, with health at the top and death at the bottom. And you're fluctuating on that continuum all the time. Health is a fluctuating quality. Your health is not something that's static or stable. It's something that varies quite widely from day to day, from week to week, and from time to time. And of course, a lot depends upon so many factors in our environment, so many factors that we are consciously responsible for. Food, air, water, sunshine, rest, sleep, physical activity, housing, ventilation, so many things that are critical to our life and health. After all, when we make a definition of hygiene, we say that hygiene is that branch of biological science which studies, investigates, and applies the circumstances and conditions upon which life and health depend. By that we mean that we are investigating and studying the various factors that are important for life and health. And then we apply those factors in the individual case to try to improve health, maintain health, or recover health. We should try to understand that the means that we employ to preserve health should be the same means that we employ to recover health. I mean, we have two philosophies in our current society. We have one where there's an enormous amount of energy and expense exploited on trying to stop people from taking drugs. A lot of advertising of how dangerous drugs are to us. And yet, on the other hand, we have an enormous profession that revolves around prescribing drugs, which are well known to be dangerous, because they can only be dispensed by certain licensed people. They can only be prescribed by certain licensed people. So it's well known how dangerous they are. And we have this sort of schizophrenia where people say, if you take drugs when you're well, they'll make you sick. But if you take drugs when you're sick, they'll make you well. Now, I realize they don't put it that way, but that is the implication of our schizophrenic belief in society. And what does a person do? They get a headache, or whatever, a symptom. So they take a pill. Well, what on earth has that pill got to do with the cause of the headache? So the headache goes away. Of course, it would have gone away anyway, sooner or later. But anyway, they take a pill, and the headache goes away. But it comes back again. So they take another pill. And this, of course, is the initiation of a chronic problem. At this point, I'll tell you a little story, which is absolutely 100% true. My wife and I, Dr. Alec Burton here, we have a friend who's an architect. Actually, he lives in Victoria, Albury, isn't it? Albury. His wife was a sufferer, or is a sufferer, from migraine headaches. Now, anybody who's suffered migraine headaches knows what a headache is. It's incapacitating. They get your visual disturbances, incredible pain, enormous sensitivity to noise and light. They have nausea, vomiting. They really feel very, very sick. So it's not surprising that they are persuaded to take a drug, a medicine, to get rid of this pain, because it is so terrible. Well, this lady was in the habit of taking drugs when she got a migraine. But this particular night, she had a very important party to go to, and she develops a migraine. Something to do with the psychology of it, of course, because she did find that whenever there was some important engagement, she would usually produce a migraine. So there's obviously some cause and effect factor there, but only a factor. Well, this lady had this migraine coming on Friday afternoon with a party on Friday evening. So she took the usual drug, immediately got rid of the headache, and went to the party. Unfortunately, at the party, she had a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke, from which she has never recovered, paralyzed on one side of the body. Well, of course, this is not isolated. There are clinical documentations of this happening almost every week among people. Because what happens? Do you really believe that by taking that drug, she removed the cause of the migraine? Of course not. Migraine is a particular type of headache and associated symptoms, which is termed vascular. The blood vessel dilates, and there are limits as to how much blood vessels can dilate before they rupture. And if they do rupture, it's usually very serious. They happen to be in a place which is pretty important, i.e., in the cranium. This poor lady, of course, as I say, has been paralysed ever since that time. But it's not an isolated case. I have personally encountered in clinical practice quite a number. But those are the sorts of consequences that can occur as a result of just ignoring the causes of disease and pressing ahead with a so-called remedy. Try to get rid of this remedy mentality. There are no remedies in the true sense, apart from those that deal with removing the causes of the trouble. Now, I realize, as I've indicated, that where a person does evolve ill health, that the causes are multiple. They may be overtired, run down, not enough rest and sleep, eating a poor diet, living on lots of coffee and tea and stimulants, overworking, subjected to enormous stress. In other words, the typical life that many individuals live. It is not conducive to good health, unfortunately. But there's a lot that people can do about it. They can reduce the stress. Okay, there are times in life when we're all going to be subjected to stress, and we just wish we could get away from it. We have to see it through. And under those circumstances and conditions, we should then apply what we know to reduce other known causes of problems. We might eat less, certainly avoid any stimulants, try to get more rest, try to get away from the stress as much as we possibly can, and see it through. We must develop strategies to deal with the causes of disease. Unfortunately, although the causes of disease are fairly well documented, people still ignore them. There was a major article in the Scientific American recently, and one of the subheadings was, it was dealing with cancer. In fact, the whole of the Scientific American was devoted to cancer in this particular issue. But one of the subheadings was relating to causality, what the causes are. And let's face it, there are hundreds of causes of cancer. But what they did say in the subheading was that 2/3 of all cancer is due to two things. Just two things: tobacco and diet. Isn't that interesting? All the major epidemiological studies now show that 2/3 of all cancer are related to diet and tobacco. And they're things that are fairly easy to deal with. That means that almost within a very short time, at the most within a decade, we could get rid of 2/3 of cancer. Isn't that an attractive possibility? In the same study, we're told that 1 in 9 women in Australia will develop breast cancer. 1 in 9, greater than 10%. That's a frightening statistic. And largely avoidable. Because there's one thing for sure about cancer, is that it can be avoided in many instances. I don't say in every case, because there are many environmental things that are beyond our control. An example was, of course, asbestos many years ago, and the people who are now suffering the consequences 10, 20 and 30 years later, an evolving mesothelioma. But the majority cancers can be avoided. And we might say the same of all chronic degenerative diseases, whether we look at diabetes. Now we look at diabetes, for instance. The recent evidence that's been coming out over the last 5 years about how cow's milk will cause diabetes in infants and children because of an autoimmune antibody response that occurs. And of course, many people will bring up their babies on cow's milk, feed their children cow's milk. They increase the risk of diabetes by doing so. So there's a lot of evidence out there about all these chronic degenerative diseases, say cancer, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, arteriosclerosis, cardiovascular disease. The major causes of all of these things are well known and well documented. A friend of ours in the United States, T. Cullen Campbell, was one of the authors of the famous China study, which was an epidemiological study in China over a 10-year period, studying mortality and morbidity in various provinces of China. It involved almost 7,000 researchers. It's called the Grand Prix of Epidemiological Studies. And from that study, they are still working on the data. They're still learning from the data that was collected, although the study was completed 5 years ago. The data that they collected is still providing useful information, because they find that in the cities in China, people live very much like those of us in the West. Whereas in many of the provinces, some of them are living on a vegan diet, some of them live a very simple life, some of them are living on a diet high in animal foods. They've got such a wide cross-section of lifestyles. But the major thing that we have to deal with is lifestyle. That is something that we can do something about. I mean, when you look in medical texts and you're dealing with etiology, the causes of pathology, you will often find subjects like genetics being mentioned. Well, certainly genetics may be extremely important. Genetics are determinants. We have what we're given. That's once again why it's important to recognize the point I made earlier about individuality. Because one person can go out and train and run a mile in 4 minutes doesn't mean to say that we can all do it, because we have limitations and potentialities that are peculiar to ourselves. But it is much more important for us to learn our limitations than it is to learn our potentialities. Now, having this information, we know that genetics is a factor. We know if we want to live a long time, the best thing we can do is to choose long-lived parents. We know that, but we cannot do anything about it. The information is not very useful to us. To say that the cause of such and such is genetic doesn't help us very much at all, because we can't go back and start again with different genes. However, lifestyle is a different matter. Lifestyle is essentially within our control. And when we're looking at the causes of disease, we should highlight those factors about which we can do something. People say to me sometimes, what's the point really? You know, we've got air pollution, soil pollution, drug pollution, water pollution, food pollution. We've got so many pollutions around. What's the point of me taking care of my health? Well, I realize there's a point in what they say. But unless we take some interest in this and push it socially, politically and economically, that's the only way we're going to change this situation. And in actual fact, in some areas of the world, things are very much improving. I know when I first visited Pittsburgh in the mid-1960s, it was a stinking place, and over 2,000 tons of soot used to fall per square mile every year. Just imagine it, 2,000 tons per square mile of soot. You go to Pittsburgh today, you would never recognize the place of 30 years ago because they've cleaned it up. Similarly with the Ohio River that flows by. But this has happened in many different places of the world. Things are being done, albeit very slowly, not nearly as fast as we would like. But of course, as our knowledge expands, once again, it's a question of education. As we educate more and more people, and they pressure the politicians, after all, we see the situation right at this very moment, with pressure on John Howard about the fluorohydrocarbons. There's already some pressure being put on it. And that's what we have to do. We have to mount pressure on the politicians to clean up the environment. But aside from that, there are many things that we can do in our own personal lives aside from this. We have a responsibility to do that. We have a responsibility to our friends and relatives, and especially our children, to do that. We can achieve this, and after all, although we see the massive sickness that surrounds us, it can be changed. As many people, or several people that I personally know here, they've changed their own lives, they've changed their own lifestyle, they've changed their own state of health as a result of their own efforts. The idea that out there somewhere there is some magic has got to be abandoned. We have to get away from this idea that there's some magic thing or magic person or magic apparatus out there that's going to transform us into the pristine purity that we might have enjoyed 50 years ago. It doesn't exist. We get health by hard work. And of course it's made harder by the society in which we live. But nevertheless, if we start small and we work on it and we influence our friends, we can do something about it. But if people get sick, they should focus on themselves, on their lifestyle, on the causes, and try and do something about it. And as people get chronically sick, we see that unfortunately their psychology changes. You've known people who are chronically sick and they turn inwards and they become preoccupied with their own symptoms and their own internal operations. And this is a nasty situation that comes about as a result of severe chronicity of the problem. The fact that they are continuously and obviously deteriorating. So they have to turn this around. And it means that they have to make a thoroughgoing change in their lifestyle. As my friend and erstwhile teacher, Dr. Herbert M. Shelton, used to say, that hygiene doesn't mean turning over a new leaf. It means turning over a whole forest. It means that you've got to have a revolution in your life. You have to see things from a different perspective. You have to realize your own responsibility in trying to care for yourself. Now, these factors that I've mentioned, in environmental factors, are a big worry. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing much we can do about it. We can certainly take steps to change our diets, to change our feeding programs, to get some exercise, to make sure we secure more rest, to develop strategies to deal with the stress that we're subjected to. We can do a great deal on a personal level. We can also, of course, secure advice from professionals on how to handle these various things. We can read books, get books from the libraries. We can listen to talks such as this and gradually educate ourselves into more healthy and more wholesome ways of living. But it's very important we do see the fundamental need to change. Now, what we need, of course, is two things. We need this willingness to learn and a willingness to change, because there can be no improvement without change. And this change does require the information and, of course, the desire to bring about these changes. Now, as a result of what I'm saying here, this doesn't mean that we have to become absolutely so preoccupied with our health that we become boring and neurotic. I mean, there's nothing worse than having a conversation with a person and all they do for half an hour is talk about their health. This can be very, very boring. We should certainly attend to our health, and then of course we don't become neurotic about it. We leave plenty of room in our life for change, variation, spontaneity. We get involved in painting, art, literature, music, or whatever. That's a wholesome and healthy thing to do. Not to become so preoccupied with our health that we lose sight of everything else. So it's important that we try to develop a wholesome, rational, sensible way of life. Right, ladies and gentlemen, well, I think we'll just have a bit of a break there. Give you a bit of a rest. I can see that some of you are falling asleep. Not that I worry if you go to sleep, at least I know you're getting some benefit from the talk. I don't mind even if you walk out, at least I know you're getting a bit of exercise. As long as you don't walk towards me, that's when I get nervous. Just have a break for about 10 minutes. Very important thing that we should understand. The hygienist repeats it time and time again for people to try and understand that healing is a biological process. Healing is not an art. There's no such thing as a healer. Healing is a biological process. It's something that the body does for itself. It's not something that somebody does to you or does for you, but something you do for yourself. So, it's very important that we understand that. Healing is a process. And that process is in continuous operation. It's part of the process of repair, of wear and tear, and so on. And the body is capable. The body is the hero. The body is capable of repair in except for the most advanced and debilitated conditions. Now, obviously, in all disease states, there's always a point of no return. There's always a point where the body can be damaged beyond repair. But nevertheless, that point is very, very rarely, except in terminal cases, reached. For the vast majority of people sick and suffering, recovery is possible. Now, it's very important to understand that healing is a biological process, that it is performed by the body. It is not performed by diet, by nutrients, by drugs, by anything external to the body. It is performed by the body. The body has the mechanism of healing. So, you know, food. Food is a material of use. It's something that the body can use. And what does it use it for? It uses it to liberate energy. It uses it to repair wear and tear, to break down to its nutrients and utilize in the performance of its functions. But the body uses the food. So a person says, you know, I've recovered my health and that diet cured me. Well, we're not prepared to accept that at all. The diet didn't cure them at all. In fact, in most cases, what enabled them to get well was the fact that they gave up the old diet. It allowed the body to recover. And there's a lot of difference. It's the same as the one I mentioned earlier about the drunken man. He doesn't become sober because he drinks coffee. He becomes sober because he stops drinking alcohol. The person recovers health to the extent that they might modify their lifestyle and in so doing remove the causes of disease. So it's important to realize that the principle of healing resides within the body, not in the diet, not in the exercise, not in the food, not in the drugs or whatever. And I remember a story that I was told as a boy that illustrates this very, very carefully and very, very well. The story was told in Yorkshire, in England, of a man who bought a property that was extremely dilapidated, and he worked very hard on it, especially the garden. And he had a most beautifully manicured garden. People used to come from miles around to see it. And one day the local priest heard about it, and he came and he saw the man working in this beautiful garden. And he said to him, "You have a beautiful garden here." And the man said, "Yes," he said, "and I've done it all by myself." And the priest said, "No, my son, with the help of the Lord." He said, "All right, with the help of the Lord, but you should have seen it when he was doing it by himself." Now the point here is very clear, of course. The principle of growth and repair and development was resident within the plants. That was what the priest was talking about. The man had no power to make those plants grow. What he did have the power to do was to provide the most favorable environment, which is what we're saying here. We have no power to heal. The body has the power to heal. No extraneous influence, material or agent has the power to heal. The body has the power to heal. But what we have to do is to provide the most satisfactory conditions and environment for it to do that. A person might say, "Look, I've gone on this new diet, I've lost weight, I feel terrible, I'm not getting well." Well, once again, maybe the diet that they've changed is not much better than the diet they had before. Maybe it doesn't provide them with their nutritional essentials. And maybe just changing their diet has nothing to do with their sickness anyway. It may be the result of many other causes. I remember just a few months ago, a gentleman who was admitted to the clinic with rheumatoid arthritis, and his knees were enormous. We did fasting, but apart from that I didn't change his diet at all. But I did deal with many other things, and he has recovered. But he didn't have to change his diet, because there was really nothing much wrong with his diet. But he was working 2 jobs, he was not getting enough rest, he was under a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, enormous financial pressures. But he took my advice. And my advice in his case was, first of all, to get rid of that mausoleum he had as a home, which was an enormous place that he couldn't possibly afford. So he and his wife sold the home, he changed his job, he got an ordinary job 9 to 5 instead of working 2 jobs and working all hours that he had available. He made a lot of other changes in his life and he's recovered. But his problem was not due to diet. So the thing is, we have to look at many other things. We mustn't get preoccupied with this diet business, nor must we think that hygiene is a special diet. It really isn't. It has a lot to do with diet, because in our society, diet is something that happens to be very important, because it's manipulated so much. But there are so many other things that are manipulated that we have to give our attention to. Now I want to talk for a little while about the subject of fasting, because fasting, I think, is probably the most misunderstood aspect of hygiene. The very thought of trying to get well and going without food doesn't seem to gel with most people. The idea of going without food is pretty unthinkable for many people. And people have this idea that if they miss a few meals, they're going to be suffering the agonies of Dante's Inferno. They think this is going to be absolute purgatory. I mean, they know what it's like when they miss a meal. They feel lightheaded, they feel sick, they feel nauseated, they feel nervous and irritable. And they think, goodness me, not only missing one meal, I might have to miss many, many meals. This is not very attractive at all. And that's quite reasonable. But it's interesting that in nature, fasting is almost as common as feeding. Many animals fast under different conditions and circumstances of life. Even domesticated animals, although they have somewhat artificial lives, they will often go without food, particularly when they're sick. Now you will observe, as I'm sure you've had the experience, that when you really get sick, usually acutely sick, one of the first things that happens is you lose your appetite. In fact, you look in the medical texts for most diseases, from influenza, smallpox, typhus, or whatever acute disease you like, you'll find that one of the first symptoms to arise is anorexia, loss of appetite. You get a foul breath, you get a coated tongue, you stink like anything, and the body is indicating unmistakably that it really doesn't want food. Not only that, we can demonstrate biochemically that the body doesn't really use the food. You give a person a high protein diet and you find that they're losing 400 grams of protein every few days as a result of the fever. The body's not using the food. So, to lose one's appetite is an indication that we should not be eating. But of course, we have this view that's instilled by convention that we should eat plenty of good nourishing food to keep up our strength. And of course, things like chicken soup come out and all sorts of fancy foods to stimulate the appetite, try and get the person to eat something. They do the same thing with people who are absolutely emaciated in cancer. We've got to try and build them up. Well, I've got news for people. You can't do it that way. And you'll find with the sick person, especially the person who's got a wasting disease, the more you try and build them up, the more they break down. And it's inevitable because the body cannot use the food. If it tells you with anorexia that you shouldn't be eating and you do eat, you won't use it properly anyway. So, we can show that the body doesn't use the food properly under these circumstances, and that in nature fasting is very, very common among other species, but not among human beings. But if food is so important, tell me this. If food builds strength, as is claimed, how do well-fed people get weak, as they commonly do? If food builds health and resistance, how do these people who are well-fed ever get sick, which people do? So food does not build resistance, food does not build health, food does not build strength. Certainly, once again, it is making this categorical mistake. And the categorical mistake is that it's the body that does it, not the food. It is the body's use of the food that builds the strength. The body's use of the material that will build health, not the food. So no matter how much food we try to feed the weak and sick person, the weaker and sicker we are likely to make them. So we are great believers that under such circumstances, the person should take what we call a physiological rest. They should undertake a fast. Now, when we fast, we go without eating. We don't go without food. The body never goes without food. We have abundant reserves in our bodies. We lost it? We've lost it. Fuse. Is that fine? Not fine, is it? The battery's flat.
It's food.
Should we get a new battery in here? Oh, it's the battery. No, nothing like a new battery, is there? I'm recharged now. Right, where was I? Everybody's forgotten what I've had to say anyway. Exactly. Thank you. The lady's learning here, all right. Now, what we have to understand is that the body has nutritive reserves. I mean, let's face it, fasting can go on for a very long period of time. There's a case in the medical literature of a man who went for 382 days on nothing but water. Of course, he was obese, he had enormous reserves. I'm not suggesting that many of you could do that, but I'm quite sure that most people would never have any real problem for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. The longest fast I've ever had associated with is 103 days. Even that's quite a long time. But usually for most people to recover health and recover an appetite, you're only talking of a few days to a few weeks, not a few months. But anyway, a few weeks even sounds a long time to most people. How can I possibly live for a few weeks without eating? Well, you're usually living on the fat of the land. You know, you've got plenty of reserves in here. And of course, if you're resting most of the time, which you should be, your calorific expenditure or your kilojoule expenditure is very low. In fact, if you think in terms of what happens during a fast, now, under normal circumstances, our currency of energy is glucose, our blood sugar level. And we all know what happens when you have hyperglycemia and your blood sugar level falls. You get weak and listless and, you get into a mess. Well, that's exactly what happens when you fast initially. Your blood sugar level falls. But of course, there are many mechanisms within the body that will support that blood sugar level. And it is maintained. It never falls below a basic physiological minimum, although that minimum may be quite low, especially in those people who suffer from hyperglycemia. But our reserves of glucose are pretty limited. We have glucose circulating in the blood. We have glycogen, which is a sort of an animal carbohydrate, in the liver and the muscles. And after a few hours, as our blood sugar level falls, glycogen is released from the liver, and we will maintain our blood sugar level again for a bit longer. But that will still only last us a day or so. During this time, of course, fatty acids are accumulating in the blood, and the body is gradually adapting to utilize fat as a source of energy rather than sugar. In the meantime, the body will release a little bit of protein, and protein will supply sugar. This is what is called gluconeogenesis, glucose from a new source. Now, after 2 or 3 days of fasting, the body adapts to utilizing fat as a source of energy rather than sugar, so we preserve our glucose. But of course, fat, which really means ketones, you'll find that a person who's fasting, if you smell their breath, they smell of acetone or ketones. These ketones are derived from the fat that is breaking down. And we all have plenty of fat reserves in the body, unless of course we are terminating with a wasting disease. But the average person has an abundance of fat. Now, fat will supply 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrate or glucose will only supply 4 calories per gram. So fat is a very, very rich source of energy. Now, the body is not as efficient at using fat as it is at using glucose. So, obviously, the person doesn't feel quite as energetic when they're burning fat as they do when they're burning glucose. They feel a little bit less energetic and a little bit listless. But nevertheless, they generally feel all right as a result of it. Now, as I say, we generally have an abundance of fat reserves. Now, if you can imagine 9 calories a gram, a mere 100 grams, that's 3 ounces of fat, is going to supply us with 900 calories. That's plenty for a day or more when we're resting. So a person who's got several kilograms of fat in the body can fast for a very prolonged period of time. And it's nothing for people to be fasting for 14, 21, 28, 35 days. That is fairly common. Fasts beyond 40 days are unusual, not common, but they do occur. But as I say, there are cases, many cases in the medical literature of fasting beyond 200 days, 250 days, and 300 days. So the fact that the body can adapt to this quite satisfactorily without any problem of starvation is clear. Now, in the medical literature, of course, fasting and starving are used interchangeably. We make a very clear distinction. Fasting is when the body is living off its stored reserves, when it has nutrients available to nourish itself. In other words, fasting means the voluntary or complete abstinence from all food except water, while nutritional reserves remain adequate to sustain normal life and function. Now, when nutritive reserves are exhausted, or some of them are exhausted, and we start to break down essential tissue, then we're entering the period that we call starvation. So we're not recommending starvation. It's quite different. Now, this process of breakdown of the fat within the body, and other things as well, is called a process of autolysis, autolysis, or self-breakdown. And it's a widespread physiological mechanism in nature. Biologists study it among organisms all the time. It occurs most widely in those organisms that undergo metamorphosis. For instance, you'll find that the tadpole, during its transformation into a frog, do you know that during that period of time, the young developing frog is actually fasting? It takes no food at any time during that metamorphosis, because it lives on its stored reserves. The tail of the tadpole is not shed as many people think. The tail of the tadpole contains proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and other nutrients that will nourish the developing frog. Now, you'll observe that during this process, and I'm sure you've all seen the metamorphosis of tadpoles to frogs, but during this process, it is a rigidly controlled physiological process. It's not haphazard. The developing frog does not suddenly start breaking down one of its newly formed legs. It doesn't start breaking down one of its eyes. No, it only breaks down the useless tissue, i.e. the tail that is breaking down to supply the nutrients. It is the same with the human body. Now, many scientific studies have been done on people fasting and also on people starving. An enormous amount of data was collected after the Second World War, and they were compiled in a book, or 2 volumes of a book entitled The Minnesota Experiment. The researchers from the University of Minnesota in the United States visited the various concentration camps and prison camps in Japan and Europe and made studies on the starving people there. Now, these were people who were subjected to not only standard nutritional deprivation, but many, many years of starvation. So we generally know how the body uses its reserves. And in death from starvation, we find that 99% of the fat has gone from the body. We find, as far as the nervous system is concerned, eyes, brain, nervous system and so on, that absolutely nothing has gone from the nervous system. the body has not turned on the nervous system for nourishment. Why? Because obviously there's a great deal of difference in the importance of the nervous system and the fat tissues of the body. So this process of breakdown that occurs during fasting to supply the nourishment to the body is a rigidly, enzymatically controlled process. It's not a haphazard process. And once we have fat reserves, nutritional reserves in the body, we can fast for a prolonged period of time. And another thing that we find in fasting is that growths, enlargements, infiltrations, swellings, tumours and the like, often that these are attacked. The usable material is used for nourishing the body and the waste material is excreted. So often these pathologies will disappear while people are fasting because the body has utilised this material as part of its nutritional program at the time. And during the fast, a lot of other things occur because in the body we have broadly, from a vegetative point of view, two processes going on the whole time. First, there's the process of assimilation, where we take on new material. We eat food, it's digested, absorbed, circulated, distributed, and utilised. That's the assimilative process. On the other hand, we have another major process called eliminative, where byproducts of metabolic activity, waste, substances inadvertently encumbering the body are eliminated. So we have these two great processes of assimilation and elimination. Now, when we're fasting, most of the processes of assimilation are suspended. We don't need to eat, we don't need to digest. We do need food, but the food is already where it's needed, i.e. in the cell and in the intercellular tissues. So it's readily available. So all the energy that we would normally expend on eating, digesting, masticating, transporting, circulating and distributing nutrients, which is quite considerable, we actually conserve in fasting. And that energy is then expended on the other great process of elimination. So we find that the elimination of waste, the breakdown of toxins, the dealing with toxins, the dealing with tumours, swellings, enlargements and the like, is more effective under this particular condition. Because we get back again to that point. Healing is a biological process, and we are providing a condition which is favourable for the healing to take place. And healing takes place at a much more rapid rate when fasting, although anabolism generally is slower. Now, one thing that is greatly enhanced by fasting, well documented in the literature, hormonal balance and the potentiation of the immune system. The immune function of the body is actually enhanced by fasting, and it's often a breakdown of the immune function that allows serious disease to evolve. This is especially so of cancer. Cancer results as a result of a defect in the immune system, a breakdown somewhere in the complexities of the immune function. Fasting potentiates immune function, enhances immune function, and is very important from that point of view. Now, generally speaking, we do not recommend that people just go home and go on a 40-day fast. We think that they should be under supervision, mainly because there are certain things that might arise when people are fasting that they probably don't understand. And it may cause panic and a very serious and bad move, like terminating the fast on the wrong type of food, which can create nutritional shock and the person will be very sick. Thanks for that. Now, as I've said, a person can fast for as long as they've got nutritional reserves. But usually what we're looking for is a good practical result. not necessarily breaking any records. Just a good practical result, enabling the person to eliminate toxins, to improve the function of their immune system, to generally restore or improve energy generation, and to improve their state of nutrition. Once we've achieved this, the fast might be terminated. But during this time, the person should be under proper and competent supervision. They should be resting. They shouldn't be engaged in physical activity and exercise of any note. Just a simple walk out into the fresh air is all right, but going for a good brisk walk is not a good idea. Once again, I refer to my earlier remark about the efficiency of the body in utilizing fat. If you do vigorous exercise, you'll force the body to break down protein. It won't do it on the fat alone. So we have to monitor these things. Now, a person may fast, as I say, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks or longer, depending on what the indications are and depending how their body responds to it. Once again, we're looking all the time, monitoring what the body does. The body gives us the indications. The body gives us the information. It's like symptomatology in pathology. When people get sick, they manifest symptoms. This is the nature of disease. So they might have spots, they might have a rash, they might have nausea, they might have vomiting, coughing, diarrhea, a whole range of things. But what is our usual approach to these things? Take a pill, take a drug, get rid of the symptoms. Well, that to me is like being out there in the bush with a map and somebody takes the map away. How do you know where you are? How do you find your way? It's very difficult. Because symptoms are the body's indication of what is wrong, what it is trying to do. They have to be interpreted physiologically. So suppressing symptoms and getting rid of them is often the worst thing you can do. If a person is in pain, you know that by what you're doing, and if the pain is going away, that they must be improving. But if you're just going to take a pill, an analgesic, and kill the pain, you have no idea whether they're improving or not, until you stop giving them the drug. And then, of course, when the pain comes back, you know they're not improving. But symptoms are the guide by which you monitor the responses of the body. And these things are very, very important. We should go out of our way to understand them and to understand the mechanisms that underlie the symptoms and the production of symptoms. I'm not suggesting that we should let people lie around unhelped in excruciating pain. I don't mean that. Obviously, when pain gets beyond a certain point, we have to intervene and try and do something to relieve the suffering. But at the same time, we've got to do it in a managed and intelligent way, not just suppression. So our interpretation of symptoms is extremely important, and there are symptoms that may arise during a fast, which indicate how the body is progressing. So our general approach to these things is to try to understand them and interfere as little as possible. The majority of them, we know, are transient. A person might get a rash, they might get aches and pains in the back and the joints, they might get a headache, they might get a little bit of nausea. Because one of the main organs of biotransformation, or the main organ of biotransformation, or detoxification in the body, is the liver. And this becomes unusually active during a fast. The body will produce large quantities of abnormal bile, which is discharged into the duodenum. It's eliminative. And one knows on the chemical analysis of the bile how abnormal it is and why it's desirable the body gets rid of it. Of course, sometimes the discharge of abnormal bile is so extensive that some of it regurgitates back into the stomach. The person might get nausea and vomit. But then again, if you were in my position and you see what comes out of people's bodies, you would agree that it's better off on the outside than on the inside. So we're not anxious to suppress symptoms, although we might modify them a little bit if they're too uncomfortable for the person. But here we see again the mechanism of healing taking place. All of this is to do with elimination. The body is eliminating. It is rejuvenating. It is regenerating. You'll find in all the literature on rejuvenation, all the medical literature on rejuvenation, it almost invariably involves some fasting. Only a couple of weeks ago there was an interview of Dr. Roy Walford. He's a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles. He wrote a book about 10 years ago called The 120-Year Diet. He's a man himself who fasts very regularly, not because he's sick, but because he wants to remain healthy and he'd like to live a long time. And he knows that by fasting we get genuine rejuvenation. And in actual fact, there's no other way known to scientists to achieve this. The body will not rejuvenate while eating. Regenerate, yes, but not rejuvenate. But rejuvenation truly takes place while fasting. Studies at the University of Chicago have demonstrated rejuvenation on a 40-year-old person to that of a person of a teenager. The hormones were assayed and measured, biochemical processes were assessed, and the rejuvenation within that body was remarkable. This was in experimental subjects. The same thing will take place in normal subjects under normal conditions of fasting. So fasting has a lot to offer, and it's a process which is so easy and so simple. You just go to bed and rest and take water. What's difficult about that? But of course it is important to understand what's going on, to have confidence in your body. We must get that confidence in the body back again. You know, it's so common in our society, we all think that while we're feeling healthy and well, the body knows what it's doing. But somehow or other we think when it gets sick, it no longer knows what it's doing. Now we've got to interfere. We've got to go and get an expert to put it right. And we actually refer to disease as disorder. We think health is normal and orderly, but disease is disorder. No, that's not true. Disease is just as ordered as is health. And the body does know what it's doing, and it doesn't act without purpose. These actions have occurred over millions of years of evolution. They are remedial processes that we see in disease. Defensive process, eliminative processes, adaptive processes. They are processes which are going to enhance or enhance the quality of the life of the subject, or enable the subject to survive. In other words, disease processes have important survival value. And the fact that the body tells us unmistakably, with this anorexic symptom I'm indicating, that we should fast and rest. I mean, you take very serious illness where there's drama, like a bad case of the flu. You've got a temperature ranging around 42, 43 degrees. You're burning up. You're prostrated. You haven't got enough energy to get off the bed. Your body has forced you to rest. But there's plenty of energy there. How do you produce a temperature of 42, 43 without energy? There's a rapid pulse, rapid heart rate. There's every indication of a lot of energy. But you've got nothing in your muscles. Why? Because the economy of the body has diverted the energy from your powers of locomotion, your muscles and so on, to the organs where all the action is taking place. But there's plenty of energy there, although you feel prostrated. And that's what happens in disease. Weakness occurs. But often the weakness is not a true weakness in the sense of the heart being weak, or the blood vessels being weak, or the liver being weak. It's only the muscles that are weak, where you don't feel energetic. That's the weakness you describe. Because the body has, through the use of the law of economy, has diverted its energy from the muscular system to the vital organs who need the energy at that particular time. And we see this repeatedly when people are sick, and especially during fasting when they're recovering. So I would urge you to study this process of fasting a little more deeply and adopt it here and there. If you get yourself upset, if you get yourself a little bit sick, then a cold or a stomach upset, fast for a couple of days. Go to bed, rest, take some water. You'll recover much more quickly. I mean, often with people, one of the things they talk about, they get a bit of a cold in the head and it drags on for a month. Or it goes to the chest and then they've got bronchitis. Diseases have a nasty habit of evolving because causes are not removed. You go to bed, you rest, you take water. A lot of the causes you've eliminated by doing that. You've given the body a chance, and giving it the chance, it will then do its work. Now, one thing that people worry about when they're fasting is you're not eating, so often you don't have a bowel motion, or at least not for a while. And of course you do have these people around who live from one bowel motion to the next. You know, the sort of person, I haven't had a bowel motion, I'd better take some Cenopos tonight, I'd better take some Cascara or something like that. When I was a boy, every Friday night you used to get the laxative. You know, the good clean out idea. This came about in the 20th century, really, because of the work of a famous British surgeon, Sir William Arbuthnot Lane. He used to operate on people, and mainly on the gut, and he advocated the total removal of the bowel. He said all disease stemmed from the bowel. Every adult should have the bowel removed. He was serious. And he was the great champion of laxatives. All disease starts in the bowel. Clean the bowel out 3 times a day at least. Take this laxative, that laxative, and so on. Well, this is all called a lot of nonsense. You have to realize that what's in the bowel is outside the body. The body has a hole through the middle. What's in the hole is not in the body. So it's already outside of the body when it's in the bowel. So don't worry about it. In other words, you should look after your business and let the bowels look after theirs. But there are cases on medical record, believe me. There's one case in the medical literature of someone who went without a bowel motion for 18 months. They weren't even fasting. They were living on the usual fare. All right, they were in a bit of a mess after 18 months, I agree, but you know, I've had patients under my care for 14 weeks without a bowel motion, where they've had terrible constipation, chronic constipation, given themselves enemas for years, interfered with the bowel function, as most people do. Well, okay, it was a long time before they had a natural motion. Nowadays, they have normal motions the same as most of us should have. So we shouldn't interfere with the bowels. But often when the person is fasting, they will go for quite a while without a bowel motion, maybe a week or two. But under those circumstances, they're not taking anything in, so why worry about it? After all, bowel motions are really voiding. It's not true elimination. True elimination takes place mainly through the kidneys and the lungs, not through the bowel. There is some occasional elimination through the liver into the bowel, but that will come out when it's ready anyway, so one doesn't have to worry about it. So, what we should try to do is find out what the most satisfactory and best conditions for the body are, and then work very hard to provide those conditions. And have confidence in the body. The body is the hero. All healing is self-healing. Healing is a biological process. Always remember that. So don't be rushing to healers, so-called healers I should say. Don't be taking drugs. Don't be rushing around and taking medicines for the least little ache or pain or symptom that you get. Give the body more credit for its innate intelligence. After all, it's evolved for thousands of years. And it was only the result of recorded history that primitive man began to start to interfere with his body. Primitive man, he used to realize that he got sick from time to time and he didn't know why. But of course, he thought that at that time that it was a punishment from the gods. He had very, very peculiar religious views, these primitive men. Everything was due to the gods. If he got food on the tree, it was because the gods were kind to him. If his crop was destroyed, it was because the gods were mad with him. And when he got sick, he believed it because he'd been bad in some way and the gods were punishing him by sending evil demons down to him to punish him. And then, of course, we got a bit more sophisticated as time went on, and we believed that these evil demons were microbes and viruses. So nowadays, we put everything down to a virus. Now, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, if the germ theory were true, there'd be none of us left alive to believe it. Even in the most serious pathological state of microbial infection, there are other factors. All infection depends on many factors, not just the germ plus the host equals disease. It's not that simple. So even the more serious viral diseases, and don't forget, a lot of people, they get sick with viruses, they'll run along and take antibiotics. Antibiotics have no effect whatsoever on viruses. But of course, the usual soothsaying thing you hear is, oh, we'll give you an antibiotic to prevent superinfection by some bacteria on top of the viral infection. Well, if you're doing reasonable things, that would not occur. But have more confidence in the body. It can deal with all of these things, but especially do it early. As soon as you get sick, take steps, take stock, examine your lifestyle, look at your diet, look at your general living, look at your activity, look at your rest and sleep, look at your stress. Look at all of these things and see what you can improve. But don't wait until you're crippled with arthritis before you decide to change. Don't wait until you've got a terminal illness. Do it before you get sick, or as soon as you see any sign that you're not as well, or as efficient, or as vigorous as you should be. But normally, you should wake up every morning thoroughly refreshed, feeling, it's another great day in paradise. Let's get on with living. But a lot of people don't do that, unfortunately. The stories I hear are almost as depressing. At the end of a day of consultations, listening to the terribly dreadful stories that I have to listen to, I'm almost weeping down my shirt front. It's so sad that people have such a struggle in life. But believe me, one of the most important facilities that we can have to deal with life is good health. Because if you've got good health, you can face most other things. But if you haven't got good health, not only are you struggling with everything else in life, but you're also struggling with your health. And that becomes a momentous task. So have more confidence in your body. Investigate the origins and causes of your problems and do something about it. Take action, change, and live your life in a way that is creative. Live your life in a way that's meaningful. And at the same time, live your life in a way that's helpful. You get much more out of it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've
Well, if you were basically okay, or thought you were.
If you were basically okay, yes, or thought you were, yes,
Well,
you might be misguided.